Okay, so we are recording now. Uh, okay. So here we come to the first slide of the PDF. What is the balance in a pin factory, or where does one stop? We have seen this pin factory, which is before the Industrial Revolution started, which Adam Smith gave his entire idea of classical economics of, right? So he was talking about that how one person, if they want to make pins, they might not even make one pin in a day, but if 18 people are working together, then they can make 40,000 needles or pins in a day. So what Bertrand Russell, so the book which I'm reading right now, and I'm loving it, and I will ask all of you to maybe, later in your life, whenever you find it feasible, just buy it and read it, right? So what it basically talks about, Bertrand Russell gives the same example, spin factory. And he says that, okay, now we had the industrial revolution, and after that we had so many factories and machines, and now we have AI technology, so much of, uh, he obviously is not talking about AI because he passed away. But if you just think about the idea which he's talking about, he says that where do you stop? Where do you stop? Pins are very cheap. The price, the more pins you will produce, cheap, the pins are so cheap they can't even go lesser, irrespective of the price. They are being sold anywhere, everywhere in the world. The demand will be a certain amount of demand which will be fixed. The supply will keep on increasing because of machines. But you, where do you stop? Because not everyone is going to buy. You're going to have massive overproduction of needles and pins because of technology and machines now. So where do you stop? So the question is deeper. What Bertrand Russell is talking about, the question that he's talking about is deeper, which is that through the help of technology, through the help of machines, through the help of AI, through the help of Alexa, Siri, no matter how feminist the entire idea is, like in opposition to feminism, the basic context is that shouldn't technology make your life easier? Why should you work for 10 hours a day, 9 to 5? Why can't you work for 9 to 2 or 10 to 2? Why do you have to work for 10 hours? The factories have increased, technology has increased, AI has increased. Over the period of time, there has been so much of development. So why are people still working 9 to 5 or even more than that? Why don't you work for 4 hours in a day? Can we imagine it? I mean, it would be utopia, right? You're like, wow, then I'll go to office every day. I will not take leave, right? No, but the point is, imagine a context where you don't have to work for so long. So why can't we have the concept of open office? Way back in 2010, 11, I saw that a lot of my Western friends, they had the idea of open office for their startup. They were not working at a particular designated time and space and company venue every day. They were working from their homes 10 years back, right? So why can't the work be much more categorically easier with the development of so much of technology? Why has capitalism still made us slave to that routine, which is very exploitative? That was the first line of thought. The second line of thought was that why do we have this entire distinction? Why do we have this entire distinction that if you are idle, it means that you are not good for anything, and if you're working a lot, no matter how much you're earning or whatever your socio-economic identity, if you're idle, why is it consider that you're useless? Why can't idleness be the reason of you creating better or innovating better? Why has your free time not been given more because of the advancement in technology? So where do you stop? Thank God we have a retirement age, right? So that is where you technically stop and you say that no, now I can't do anymore. But that is for government jobs. In private jobs, you don't have 60 or 65 as a retirement age. You can still work. So where do you stop? And why can't you basically decide on how many hours? Why can't the greater hierarchies of power you go in your office or job or your niche? Why can't you dictate over the time? So that is something which Bertrand Russell is basically saying. So the person who wrote the introduction, the professor who wrote the introduction for this book, he said that he was, you know, reading about he was eating apricots and peaches in a small village in France, I guess. And then he says that Bertrand Russell explains how apricot comes from China and then it comes from India and then goes to Rome and then goes to, other European countries. And he says the more I understand this entire voyage of apricot and how the origin of the term apricot is from precocious, which means that in English, which means that something which ripens very easily. And the term A, the alphabet A has been written in like by mistake. It should be apricot and not apricot. So I feel much more satisfied when I'm eating it. And he also says that if I'm sitting in this garden and I'm looking around and I'm just idle, I can read and understand Bertrand Russell and I cannot understand him if I'm in a very hectic job. So where do you stop working? Why can't technology makes our life easier, supposedly? Right. So that is the basic context of where we start. So to the answer to that is the Say's law. Now, John Baptiste Say was a French economist from 1767 to 1832. He was a French economist who basically said that he was also in favor of free trade, and obviously he's French, so he will not be
Excuse me, ma'am.
mercantilist. Yes.
Ma'am, are you sharing the screen?
Yes. Are you not able to see it?
No, ma'am.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, ma'am, we're not able to see it.
Oh, so sorry. Now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Hmm. Okay, so the previous slide was nothing actually much more than just the pin factory. Here you can see the question was, where does one stop? Right. Here we are coming to Say's law. So you can see, look at John. And he was also, in favor of free trade and he was against mercantilism and all of that. So he says that it will never happen that there's overproduction of an item. Bertrand Russell's first question was, though Bertrand Russell was born later, but his question is that you will have overproduction of pins. Don't produce so much, right? But Say is basically saying his law is that you are never going to have, it is the law of the market, that you're never going to have excess supply over demand. The supply will also always be in tandem with the demand, and this is why capitalist economy will always grow. So he says that, the reason why a particular product is getting oversupplied is because some other product is not getting supplied properly. Right. So here in this case, in the Say's law, he basically take this entire idea. You don't have to go very deeply into it. You just have to say it from the idea that Say's law is that there will never be overproduction of a product in the market. That is why capitalism, he said this in support of capitalism, that no matter how much of production will be there, as you look at the entire world economy, there are so many people. The population is rising because of technology and food supply and lack of pandemic before and all of that. But so look at it. There will never be enough to meet the demands of everyone. The law of market is that the widespread supply of a product will always, cater to the demands which are there. So there will be no overproduction, is what he's saying. This is what we're going to take. And say someone who Ricardo is going to always follow, right? So here we come to David Ricardo. You look at the spelling, I made the email. So he was born in 1772. In few places, you will see that he was born in 1771. So there's a debate between 1771 and 72, but he dies in 1823. So thank God that is not debated. He's 49 years younger to Adam Smith, right? And he is a Brit. Adam Smith is Scottish and he is Brit. He was born in London. He was a political economist, a classical economist actually, and he lived for 51 years. He died pretty young, like he didn't live for 80, 89, 30, 90 years. Okay. So before we come to understanding Ricardo, we have to understand what is classical economics. As we understood in the last class, that economics is basically the subject which was started in a very concrete way and writing about the Greek and Roman times and all of that for the first time. Adam Smith did it in 1776. So, and it emerged in UK in 18th and 19th century. So you had so many economists like Smith, like Ricardo, like James Mill. You had uh, just a sec. Yes. So basically, and Malthus, the one who is the student of Adam Smith, who talked about the Malthusian trap. He was also, these four economists were very famous. So Ricardo had two best friends. One was Malthus, who was a student of Adam Smith. Malthus gave the very famous Malthusian trap, which says that as we go ahead in time, right, as we go ahead in time, what happens is that because of pandemic or because of the lack of resources and technology, the population will not grow. It was broken after 1750, but this is basically the Malthusian trap. So Malthus and Ricardo were very good friends, though they used to debate a lot. And the second very good friend of Ricardo was James Mill. James Mill's son will be John Stuart Mill, who is the very famous philosopher, right? So this is the context, and James Mill is Scottish also, and Ricardo is British, by the way. Adam Smith led to the emergence of classical economics. He was the founder of it, and it was followed by David Ricardo, and then later John Stuart Mill also used it, and Malthus also used it. So, what is classical economics? So, classical economics is very much against the mercantilist idea, which was there during that time. It was against mercantilism. It believed in the free trade and free market, and it believed in the idea of supply and demand. Right. This is the basic context of classical economics. So when I say that I'm a classical economist, it means that I believe in the law of demand and supply. I believe that, free trade is essential. I believe in competition. I do not believe in state intervention in the market. I believe in the invisible hand. And I believe that there should be economic freedom and economic growth in the country. Now we come to Life of Ricardo. So basically, when Wealth of Nations was published in 1776, depending on when Ricardo, 71 or 72, he was born, he was only 4 or 5 years old, right? And why is Ricardo famous? So Ricardo wrote two books, which we are going to talk about. And he's famous for three ideas, for three basic ideas. The first basic idea is labor theory of value. So I'll give you an example of it. So, say for example, I was having construction work in February and March, and you have two kinds of people that you need for construction work. One is called the mistri, and the other is the mason, and the other is called the laborer, who will do bring the bricks and bring the cement and bring all of that, and they'll do taking away the previous slabs of cement and all of that. So every day I was paying 2,000 rupees to two of them, right? Say after finishing the construction work, if tomorrow they want to do a construction in their own house, can they afford it? Can they afford the construction in their own house? Do they have control over it? Because Adam Smith basically said that when you, the labor theory of value, which Adam Smith talked about, he said that when you pay your maid something, 300 rupees or 500 rupees or 1,000 rupees a month, you're saving yourself from that labor, and also you have command over 1,000 rupees, so you can pay, right? So can my construction workers have construction in their own house at the same rate? Or can your maid have a maid? The labor that she's doing, can your maid keep a maid in her house? The answer is no. So why? We'll go and understand what Ricardo said. The second thing that he talked about is comparative advantage in free trade. What it is, we'll talk in the next class, but in a gist, I'll give you that if you see trade between India and Sri Lanka, and India is producing, in less time, both cotton and coffee or tea. So why should it trade with Sri Lanka, which takes more time and more labor to produce cotton and coffee? What is the advantage which India will have if it? Why should it trade? Because it is self-reliant. Why should it trade? So that is where comparative advantage comes over. And then he gave this theory on rent. So what is rent in his definition? We are going to talk about. And couple of things that you have to understand, that Ricardo was not an academic. He came from a stockbroker family. In fact, during his time, the designation was called as stock job. Father was a stock jobber, so it eventually changed into stockbroker. And he read in 1799. He was 27, 28 years old when he read Adam Smith for the first time. Like imagine a businessman having a son, and then the businessman wants his son also to be the businessman, and the businessman suddenly reads a book by some famous philosopher, right? When he's, later in his late 20s. So he was not an academic. His language was not very flowery and very elegant, though Adam Smith was also difficult to understand because he wrote in that kind of language which was difficult to understand, right? But Ricardo was not trained as an academic, and he understood that, like he was very straight to the point. At times he was very convoluted, but he didn't use very difficult words and difficult narratives or proverbs or very difficult context and everything, because he was a stockbroker. He was not an academic who wanted to be a professor. He was a hardcore capitalist who wanted to make a lot of money. So you look at this picture, childhood of Ricardo. His parents had 17 kids. Can you imagine? In this picture there are not 17, obviously, and I have no idea who is Ricardo here, but he had like his parents had 17 kids, and Ricardo was the third one, right? And they lived in London. And at the age of 14, so imagine when at the age of 14, when Adam Smith is pursuing his higher education, when he's going ahead and doing his what do you say, undergraduation or graduation of that time. At that time, Ricardo is asked by his father to join stockbroker, contractual stockbroker job, just as he did, right? The interesting thing about both Adam Smith and Ricardo is that Adam Smith also, his father was custom, and eventually Adam Smith became a custom agent, right? In the same way, Ricardo, his father was a stockbroker. He also became a stockbroker eventually. So you're seeing reflections of, so a son of the king is becoming the king. The son of a stockbroker is becoming the stockbroker. A son of academic or custom agent is becoming a what do you say, custom agent. Adam Smith had no child, so it stopped over there for him. So yeah, here. So why is it important? Why, as I said, that his life is much more important than just an economic lens. You see the map? There are basically he was a Jew. His family was Jewish, just as Karl Marx was Jewish. And basically, what is the entire storyline? Why am I teaching you about this? So there are three categories of Jew. I'm not talking about the Jews in India. There's a Jewish synagogue near Khan Market also in Delhi. Jews in Northeast, you have Jews in South India also. In Calicut also, I think you have a synagogue. But we're not talking about the Asian ones. Here we are talking about three different categories of Jews, right? The first category, which is the highest in the hierarchy, right? The highest in the hierarchy, they are known as Ashkenazi Jews. These are the Jews who migrated from Europe. You can see the European countries, Eastern plus Western Europe. Those who went to Israel after it was founded in 1948, and they originated or they migrated from these European countries, they were called as Ashkenazi Jews. They are the highest in the hierarchy in Israel also, right? The second comes Sephardic Jew. Now, Sephardic Jews were Jews basically from Spain or from Portugal. Now, you'll say they are also Europe, right? But there's a lower hierarchy. And family basically was Sephardic. The family migrated from Netherlands, but they originally came from not originally they'll come from Israel, obviously, but the idea is that they originally came from Netherlands. And the third kind of Jews that you can see, which are the Mirzahis Jews, these are Middle Eastern, the West Asian Jews who are from, say, Egypt or Saudi Arabia and all of that. So they are the lowest. They are also Bedouins, like their color is black or brown, and they are lowest in the hierarchy or in the supremacy scale within Israel. So he came in the middle one, which is Sephardic Jew. So here we come to the interesting thing. You look at this woman who is at the right side, and her name is Mrs. David Ricardo. So basically, her name was Priscilla, and Ricardo fell in love with her. And after they fell in love, they eloped because they hardcore conservatives. And he knew that now there's going to be some kind of huge drama in his family. So what happens is that he is disowned by his parents. His mother never talks to him again. You can say that, yes, she has 16 other kids, she'll talk. But the point is that she never talks. His father never talks with him. He is disowned by the family. The stockbroker work that he used to do with his father, the father says that, no, you are not eligible to do it anymore. You're not part of this family. You have to get out. So Ricardo gets out. It's like kabhi khushi kabhi gum. He gets out. That okay, I'm not going to, go back to this family. I will stay in London only, right? So what happens is that now what was the religion of Priscilla? So Priscilla was basically a Quaker, not the Quaker oats that we eat. Quaker, she was a Quaker was a certain kind of theological stream of thought in Christianity, also called as religious society of friends. So you can see that it is a congregation. It is not Protestant or Orthodox or Catholic. It is a congregation called as Religious Society of Friends, and this is a symbol, the red, black and red symbol that you see. And they basically believed, because in that time, when it was founded, that time there were a lot of pandemics that were happening. UK was into a lot of wars. It had its own civil war in the 17th century. So Quakers strongly believe that you don't need clergy to have a direct contact with Christ or God. You don't need the church. Just in the Hinduism idea, saying that you don't need the temple to actually have a connection with Krishna or Ram or with Vishnu, Shiv, Brahma, anyone. Because the church was so interventionist in everyone's life. They broke out of the Church of England. They said that we believe in Christ, we believe in God, we believe in all the practices, but we don't believe that we have to attend church regularly and then we have to, follow the Christian faith according to what the clergy is saying us. Right? They were also against participating in wars. They didn't used to participate in wars. They used to dress in a very plain attire, and they believed in teetotalism, which is drinking a lot of tea. No, actually, teetotalism is that complete abstinence from alcohol and any kind of, drugs and all of that. So they never used to have alcohol and everything. They believe very strongly that if you have a strong faith, Christ Himself, in everyone's life there are issues or times where God Himself manifests. You don't need the church. So at that time, what was the interesting thing was that in England, during that time, the Quakers were not married in the church and the Jews were not married in the church. They were all considered as outsiders. So what happened that both of them ran away. They went to their own different kind of church, and there they got married and they eloped and they left. But Ricardo never, when he like ran away at the age of 21, he never converted into a Quaker. He converted into some other form of theology, but not a Quaker. And they both of them would go ahead and have 8 kids together. So coming to what did he become? So he became a Unitarian or Unitarian is a certain, belief in one God. So when we were studying about Hegel, we studied about the Holy Trinity, that there was God, there was Jesus, and there was the Holy Spirit, the Holy Spirit, right? So in the followers of Unitarianism, the people who follow Unitarianism, they believe that yes, Jesus saved us. Jesus had a message. He sacrificed and he, gave peace and tranquility to all those who had sinned. He was a savior, right? No debate on that. But he was not a manifestation of God. They believe that God is only one. God is not in the Holy Spirit. God is not in Jesus. Even though they believe that Jesus did come and he did save humanity. So Ricardo becomes Unitarianism follower, which is Christianity. So he changes from Judaism to Christianity. And what happens is that once he was very smart and he was very clever as a stockbroker. So there was this bank in England of Lubbock and Foster Bank, which then, supported him because he also had a lot of self-respect. He was like, I'm not going to ask my father and beg him. He was like Shah Rukh Khan. So he was supported by this bank, and the bank started helping him. Okay, we'll fund you. You start your job, you start your business, we'll fund you, and all of that is happening. It is at the age of 27, you know. So after 6 years of running away, at the age of 27, he reads about Adam Smith for the first time. So Adam Smith, then this is when Adam Smith comes in his life. And then after 10 years of it, 10, 11 years of it, he's going to write his first book. So for the first time, it is like, for example, so someone who is from science background over here, or someone who is from commerce background over here, and suddenly you are studying about philosophy. And after this class, a class that you have on Coursera or any other platform, what starts happening is that you start thinking about it and you believe that, oh my God, I really have the knack for understanding philosophy. Why didn't I, do philosophy in my +2, or why didn't I do philosophy in my undergraduation? Or in the same way, like for me, it happened that I studied IR later in my life and I realized that why did I do bachelor's in media, in that case. So you start questioning. So this was the revelation that, changed his life. He
Ma'am,
before that, yeah,
what he was born in 1772.
yeah.
So I
Sorry,
mean,
1799. Sorry, 1799
uh,
over here. I'm very sorry. 1799. Thank you for pointing it out. So at 1799, he's 27 years old. And this is the revelation of his life. And he starts thinking that, okay, there is this academic discipline called economics. And there's this guy called Adam Smith who wrote this book, Wealth of Nations, right? And he reads it and he understands there's something called as classical economics and law of supply and demand and invisible hand, and he suddenly feels that, oh my God, I'm really interested in knowing about all of this, right? So after years of it, in 1810, 10 11 years of it, he writes this first book, The High Price of Bullion, a proof of the depreciation of banknotes. He's 38 years old now. And you see, there are different copies, there are different publications like print copies of his book, which shows that it did become a bestseller. But this was not the reason why Ricardo became famous. This book was not the reason why he became famous. He would become famous later. And these books are like, there was this Morning Chronicle newspaper where he used to write letters. So I don't know how many of you write letters to the Hindu or letters to Indian Express and, to the editor, and it is printed, right? So this book is a collection of all those letters which he was writing to the Chronicle on the topic of money or commerce or economic policy of UK. So now understand, from 1772 to 1823, what all he must have, like, he must have been a part of what? Not a part of, but this happened during his lifetime. The American independence, 1776, right? Then he must have had this 1789 French Revolution, then the coming of Napoleon, then Hegel has written his book in 1807, right? So all of these things are happening during his time frame. These are the main things that are happening during his time frame. So what is this book basically about? We don't have to go a lot into the detail of it. So look at this building. It is the Bank of England. So if you go to London, you'll see that all the buildings are as lavish and exotic. It looks like a museum, right? So most of the, even the railway stations, even, you know, any kind of a hotel or whatever, so very intricately designed. So colonial power. So this was the Bank of England, which was formed in 1694. So what is he talking about in the high price of bullion? So industrial revolution has taken place during his life. It didn't take place during the life of Adam Smith, but industrial revolution has taken place in the life of Ricardo. Now he is going to still, but mercantilism is not something which will immediately vanish after industrial revolution. It will happen in stages. Capitalism will come in stages, right? So what started happening was Bank of England was under a lot of crisis. Initially, the payment which was done was through gold and silver. It was the legal tender, right? And suddenly, legal tender is like your note of 2000, which is now new after demonetization. It is the legal tender, and the initially you didn't have any kind of legal tender for 2000 rupees. The 500 rupees note that you have right now is legal tender. Have 500 rupees? I'm forgetting. The different kinds of, so now the 100 rupees note you have is of different color. The Purana 100 rupees note that you had, that is also legal tender, irrespective of the color. The 10 rupees note right now, which you have, is of the same, you know, like, uh, you have different kinds of 10 rupees note. All of them are legal tender. But 2000 rupees was not legal tender before demonetization. So in the same way, what was happening is that legally the tender was what, gold. Then it shifted to cash payments. Then you had the currency. After that, you'd have the entire debate over currency of pound and euro and so many things later. But now what is happening? There are a lot of banks. This is only one Bank of England, which is there in London, but there are a lot of different. UK is huge and it has colonized Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And it will have banks over there also, right? So how to have connection between all these banks? How do you create a hierarchy? How the supremacy of which bank is a central bank and which is a private bank? All of these right now, which look very normal to us, these were in the very initial stages of forming all of this. So we understand that if there's a lot of cash, then you'll have inflation. Look at Venezuela, look at Iran, there'll be price rise. It is very easy for us to understand it right now. But during that time, when Ricardo was there, this connection was not theorized. How, in which way Bank of England should give loans, how it should formulate a monetary policy, how it should control the price of pound, how it should, lend, what are the parameters on which it should lend, and why basically, the banknotes, the value is going down. Why is it going down in terms of value? Why is bank giving so much of lending? Why there is no policy? Why, how can you connect different banks? What is the idea of money? How do you give, because initially you had gold and silver and now then you have cash, and how do you make sense of the transition? How will your population make sense of transition which is not from the economics background, right? So these were the things that he was talking about in this first book. These were printouts of the letters to the chronicle he was writing, and that is what, after reading Wealth of Nations, he decided. So initially, when this book was published, there were a couple of things which became very apparent. The first one was that he did not have this very exquisite and very flowery language or very intricate language. He was very to the point, but at the same time, it was very crass also, because he doesn't have the academic training to write. So it, his Adam Smith was difficult to understand because he had too much academic training to write, and Ricardo was difficult to understand because he didn't have any academic training to, you know write. So he, that was his writing. Now we come to 1815. It is the Battle of Waterloo. You see the painting over there. So here we come to the favorite Napoleon who is there and who had enchanted Hegel. That Hegel is, there's a battle of Jena going on in his university, and Hegel is supposed to submit the manuscript of his book, and he's instead sitting and watching at Napoleon with all these puppy eyes and he's so enamored by Napoleon. So we are talking about the same Napoleon. What happened with one of the reasons why in any revolution it is predicted that the revolution will eventually lead to a worse dictatorial state than what it fought out from. There's one theory of looking at revolution. Now, I'm not talking about uprisings. I'm talking about a revolution where the entire structure is changed. The political, social, cultural, economic structure is changed. And then what happens is, often than not, the revolution, after the revolution, the political clout which replaces the initial one is much more dictatorial. So what was the end point of French Revolution? You had a French emperor. You were upset with Louis 17th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th and all of that, and now you have an emperor who is who? Napoleon Bonaparte, who his years of power were 1804 to 1814, right? This was his year of power, years of power of 10 years. Then he was defeated. He was sent to an island, Italian island in Alba, and then he ran away from there and came back to have a fight, and he's again having a fight. So who is he fighting with? He's fighting with Austria, Prussia, Russia, UK, all of it. You had generals like Duke of Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, many others who were against him, and they were like, oh my god, he's back, and we have to, and he's again coming with so much of army. So what happened in the Battle of Waterloo was that the French army had the most number of guns, combining Austria, Prussia, Russia, UK. Imagine, he has just come out of, he ran away from a prison, and he comes out and he gets ready with another army. He's ready to be, fight for his empire again and for the domination of France. And he has the most of guns. His army has the most of cavalry men, most of artillery when you combine with all of them. And even then, he's defeated. Even then, he's defeated. So what happens after that? He's defeated, and Saint Helena, which is a small island which is taken over by UK, and there he dies at the age of 51. So Ricardo is going to make a lot of money out of Waterloo, but the fact is that both Napoleon and Ricardo die at 51 years of age. Both of them. So serendipity. Anyway, so, and also for Indians, why is he important? Because he wanted to have an alliance with Tipu Sultan. So imagine if Napoleon would have succeeded and the infiltration of France would have been stronger in India, then we would have been colonized by France. So what happened with Napoleon was that there were so many people, so many theorists who came over and said that what happened that Napoleon and his army, irrespective of high numbers, better guns, better gunpowder, all of that, why did they lose the battle? So there were reasons. The first reason was that on June 17th, which will happen after 10 days, exactly. So on June 17th, what happened that during the battleground of Waterloo, Waterloo is in Belgium. The capital of Belgium is Paris. No, Brussels. So what happens is in Waterloo, it rains. It starts raining on 17th of June. So Napoleon takes a step off. The ground is very wet and all of that. That is one reason which a lot of, supporters have said. The second reason is that when Prussia enters without any hint. Like when their army enters, it is like a certain kind of assault in the way they enter Waterloo. So that is considered one of the reasons why Prussia was, the defining power that won the Battle of Waterloo. And the third why it is considered that Napoleon will win Waterloo, but he lost it, is because there were certain kinds of backstabbing within his army also. So these three reasons were there why he lost a battle, which if he would have won, then France would have been stronger than UK in terms of colonizing other countries. So this happens. So how does Ricardo make money? He's a stockbroker. So you understand, he's trading. So just as in coronavirus, the stocks and prices of a lot of items have gone, or of products or companies have gone down. People are not looking at their stock prices because it will give them a heart attack, right? It has gone really, really down, of airlines, of many other hospitality industry and all of that. So in the same way, in Waterloo, Ricardo had put bet on the seventh coalition that they are going to win. But there was every evidence which was there that it is Napoleon who is going to win. But eventually what happened is that the seventh coalition wins and Ricardo eventually makes a lot of money out of it. Now look at what he does. So he has a house in London and 8 kids and all of that. He has made a lot of money out of Waterloo. Waterloo battle is also important because it changed the way in which Jews themselves lived in England. There were a lot of Jews who made money out of Waterloo, not in a condescending way. I'm like saying in a cultural way in which they were respected much more in the job that they did and the identity that they had. And a lot of them gained much more of name, fame, and affluence in terms of their identity after the Battle of Waterloo, especially those who were in finance. And most of the Jews were businessmen, so they were certain kind of emancipation in their lifestyle. So by the age of 42, I don't know how many of us will be able to do this in our life, but he became a billionaire then. And by the age of 42, he retired. Like, I'm not going to do any stockbroker work. I'm going to indulge in maths and I'm going to study literature. I'm going to study geology. I'm going to study, many other, literature and all of that, history. So what happens now is that you see this uh, house. It's a huge house, huge bungalow. So he purchased this. It is called as Gatcombe Park, and it is in a small county which is in the, I think, southern western side. I'm not very sure, but it is in the one of the sides of England, and it is basically now a royal. This house is a royal house now of Princess Anne. So he bought this house. Imagine how much money he had in that time. And during that time, the seat in the House of Commons, so our Lok Sabha, the equivalent of our Lok Sabha, your UK Parliament has House of Commons and House of Lords. So during his time, the seat in House of Commons could be purchased. So he purchased the seat in House of Commons for £4,000. He bought a seat for himself. So he became a politician. Ricardo, who was a stockbroker, became a politician in House of Commons, a minister. Can you imagine? Now it's very easy for us because we see the connection between politics and corporate industry. But at that time, it was a huge thing. And Ricardo was not coming from a very privileged background of academia or aristocracy. He didn't know how to talk very well. So this was a massive improvement in his lifestyle in terms of identity. So what was known about him during that time was also that Ricardo never used to talk a lot in the House of Commons, but he would always talk about the monetary policy of UK, and that is how he will go ahead with. Okay. Now in 1817, he writes his magnum opus, why he has become immortal because of this book. There are thousands of different covers of it. The name of the book is On the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. In short form, if you go and talk with an economist or a graduate or a scholar from economics background, they don't say it as principles of political economy and taxation. They will just say principles, and it is understood that you're talking about Ricardo's the book, right? So the name of the book is The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. The short form is principles. That is what often economists say. They don't write the whole book, right? The name of the whole book. It was written in 1817. So he must be in his late 40s now. What does this book talk about? So what we are going to study in the next class, whatever we are going to study in the next class, is basically coming from this book. So he talks about comparative advantage in this book. We are going to study about comparative advantage that was mentioned in this book. Then he talks about rent theory. Just a second. Someone has to mute their. Uh, where do I go? Okay. Please, everyone, mute yourself. Okay. So he talks about comparative advantage. Then he talks about the rent theory that we are going to study. He talks about less corn laws. I'll discuss in brief about the corn laws right now. He is again a supporter of free trade. He's a supporter of free trade, and he is against mercantilism, obviously, because he's a classical economist. Then he will be against mercantilism. He is also not so much in terms of state intervention. But look at the funny thing that he is also part of the state, right? And he gives you three classes in society. Like Marx will tell you, there are two classes in society. One is the bourgeois, which my students call bourgeois. The spelling is very difficult to remember. And then the other is the proletariat, right? But Ricardo will give you three classes. One is the landlord or the landowner. The second is the capital owner or your bourgeois. And the third is the working class. So he gave three categorizations, and he gave this labor theory of value. In 1823, he had this ear infection and some septic, and eventually he dies at the age of 51, just as Napoleon did at the age of 51. He was an abolitionist. What does it mean? It is very important right now to understand the meaning of this term. This term is basically someone who does not stand in support of slavery. So if you, like Abraham Lincoln became an abolitionist towards the end, after his Gettysburg Address, or towards the Gettysburg Address, when he said that democracy is for the people, of the people, by the people. When he said that slaves should be freed, it is, complete discrimination, and they should be rendered, equal in the society. Because American Constitution, which was written by Thomas Jefferson, even then he doesn't talk about equality by including the people. So one good thing about Ricardo was that he believed in equality. He was against slavery, right? And that is very what do you say, empowering of someone at that point of time, especially in the circle that he came from. There can be reasons, if you want to understand, because Jews have been stigmatized for a very long time, right? Jews have been stigmatized for a very long time in the society. So he understood what it means to be stigmatized. He understood what it means to be victimized. So he believed that the black slave should be freed in UK. That will happen in 1833, after 10 years of his life, after, like, he dies after 10 years of his death. So coming to what is the corn law. So corn basically is not your corn like bhutta or maize, or not that. It is corn was the term which was used at that point. It was a metaphor or a term which was symbolic for wheat. It was symbolic for wheat. So what was happening during that time in the parliament was, in the UK parliament, what was happening right now at that point of time was that the wheat which was coming from different countries, the wheat which was coming from different countries, it was being imported, that was put at a tariff or a higher rate, so that it is much more expensive than the wheat which is produced there in England. And at that point of time, there was this there was a famine that took place in Ireland, which was further circulated to the region of Wales, England, Scotland. The question came that how can you have wheat at such a high price, be it domestic or be it, the one which is imported. How can you have that at such a high price when people are dying of famine? The same question, that how can you have masks at 200 rupees which happened in March, then people are dying. It should be subsidized. How can you have vaccine which will be very expensive if you have to fight with COVID? Logic. So this is the reasons why Ricardo said that you should not have this kind of tariff, or you should not have this kind of any kind of control mechanism over wheat or corn. There should be a repeal of the corn laws, which is what he basically talked about. It was very brave and courageous of him also to give a view like that, because it also would then later lead to some kind of reaction from the House of Commons or from the circle where he was, especially from the factory owners, right? That he is speaking against us. He's more with the working class. But Ricardo also had one tendency which was there in him, because he had seen Industrial Revolution. He had started predicting at that point of time that over the period of time, technology is going to infiltrate our lives, and the working class people are going to be victims of technology. So the labor is going to pay the price of the technological improvement. Obviously, when you have, so Microsoft then hired right now so many journalists, 30 plus journalists, so that artificial intelligence is going to do the job, right? China already had the news reader model where the AI is actually reading the news. Journalism, you're seeing that how the AI is going to replace human journalists in the next, say, 50 years. This is the trend that we are seeing in happening right now. That was the same trend which he saw in terms of the technology coming in. So how did he see that and how did he react? So if you want to think about it, you have to think about, like Habermas basically tells you about how these discussions were carried out during that time. These discussions were carried out in coffee shops, in barber saloons, by men, white men who were elite. And they would go to a barber saloon or they'll go to a coffee shop and they'll discuss about all of this. And that coined the beginning of a public sphere when the public was coming together and interacting. Right. So he had this own circle where he was talking about it at that point of time. So he had kind of inclination which was in support of the working class. Right. But his labor theory of value, which I talked to you about, which in a gist that, your maid cannot have a maid. Even if she's earning salary and she must be working in 10, 15 households, but she cannot afford a maid. Right. Why? Why is that? We are going to study that in the next class. But he basically, Ricardo, gives you the idea that there is something called as dead capital or indirect capital. He gave this idea of indirect or dead capital. And this dead capital is what Karl Marx is going to use in his labor theory of value, in ways in which he's going to say that how the working class is exploited by the bourgeois through this dead capital. So this idea of capital or indirect capital was given by Ricardo. So when you look back, a lot of economists will say that Karl Marx was lucky that he had two very good, inspiring figures in his life whom he could twist or turn, and the dogs have gone mad anyway. So he could twist and turn and he could take impression from. So he had Hegel, and he used his idea of dialectics in the socio-economic realm. And then he had David Ricardo. So a lot of people say that Karl Marx was very lucky that he had the concept of dead capital given initially, which you are going to study in the next class, by David Ricardo. Otherwise, Karl Marx wouldn't have been Karl Marx. So we have done in the very beginning also, like, how, for example, Karl Marx wouldn't have been Karl Marx if there was no Kant and there was no Hegel. Right. So in the same way, Karl Marx wouldn't have been Karl Marx if there was no Ricardo also, because Ricardo gave the basic idea of exploitation unknowingly. Even though Ricardo didn't stand for it, he was against it. But he did start understanding that how the very idea of technology, factory, industrialization, and the very nature is going to exploit labor. Okay. So we are coming to the end of it. As I said, today will be a shorter class. So you have to go home today and study about comparative advantage, because it's a very, very confusing term. It's not as easy as comparative advantage. So when I'll teach you, I'll be using graphs and I'll be using digits and numbers, and I'll be doing division and all of that. So for people here who are scared of maths, is going to be difficult to understand in the first go. So what your homework is that you go ahead and Google what is comparative advantage. Now your way of how do you Google or how do you, that is also an art. So you go to YouTube and search for comparative advantage, any video that you can find. Or you go to Google and search for a research on comparative advantage that you can find. Right? Go on Khan Academy and search that do they have something on comparative advantage of Ricardo. Right? Okay. Our Twitter handle is learning_fluid. Most of the tweets will be done after 12 o'clock at the night. So you can get up in the morning next day and figure out. The hashtags are fluid learning and Saturday study group. So even if you search with the hashtag, you'll be able to find out whatever I'm tweeting. And this is what we have to study from Ricardo. The first thing is that Ricardo was not from an academic aristocratic background. He was a stockbroker. He came from a Sephardic Jewish background in London. He wrote two very famous books. The books are the second book, which is about taxation and the principles of it, is basically much more important. It gives the idea about rent, the theory of rent, gives the idea of labor theory of value of Ricardo, gives the idea of comparative advantage. What does he not stand in favor of? He is against mercantilism. He's against mercantilism. He's against state intervention, irrespective of the fact that he's a part of the House of Commons, right? And he's against slavery. Slavery will be, the legal act in UK, which will undermine or finish slavery, will happen in 10 years later his death. But during his time, there was slavery, right? So these are the things that we have to understand. Why do we have to understand Ricardo? So normally when you study about capitalism, or if you study about the insights into Marxism, Adam Smith is studied, but Ricardo is not studied very deeply. Why is he important? He is important because he gave the idea of capital, which is dead capital or indirect capital, in his idea of labor theory of value, which was, this is Harley Davidson, or there's another bike. Okay. Which is very, very famous. And the idea of dead capital is what causes a lot of exploitation, which Marx is going to talk about. That is why Ricardo is important. And he also will talk about comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is necessary for economic students to understand, and for others also, so that you understand why, irrespective of how many times, all, be it Brexit or be it MAGA of US, or India being economical protectionism and all of that, why it is not feasible. Yes, so this is how we finish the class. And then if any of you have questions, you can ask. I don't know if you guys can listen to it. Preet, what is teetotalism? Teetotalism is drinking a lot of tea. You can Google it. I'll ask you, Preet, that what is teetotalism? It's not drinking a lot of tea. Don't. Fine.